Within 72 hours of a 100% tariff, gas prices in the Midwest will skyrocket, and the lights in New York could literally go out. Canada provides 60% of America's oil and 85% of its electricity, and right now, that entire supply line is being held hostage by a geopolitical chess match between Trump and China. While everyone is talking about the social media insults between Governor Carney and the White House, they are missing the ticking time bomb hidden in Article 34.7 of the USMCA. It's a sunset clause designed to kill the North American trade deal on July 1st, and Canada just gave Trump the perfect reason to pull the trigger. This morning, at approximately 11:02 a.m. Eastern Time, the President of the United States issued a statement that effectively froze the North American economy in its tracks. In a post that has sent the Canadian dollar into a freefall and triggered emergency cabinet meetings in Ottawa, he has threatened to impose a 100% tariff on every single good coming from Canada into America. Not 10%, not 25%. A total 100% doubling of prices on every Canadian import. The stated reason is clear: Canada's newly minted strategic partnership with China. To the White House, this isn't just a trade deal, it's a betrayal of the North American alliance. But if you think this is just another typical Trump tariff story, you need to look closer. We are currently watching the most significant rupture in the Canada-US relationship since the War of 1812. What's unfolding right now involves a fundamental realignment of power, a desperate search for economic sovereignty, and a ticking time bomb known as the July 1st USMCA review. The next 6 months will determine whether Canada remains the most integrated partner of the world's largest economy or becomes a casualty of a new Cold War. To understand why Canada is suddenly caught in this vice between Washington and Beijing, we have to look at the events of the last 14 days. On January 13, 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney did something no Canadian leader has dared to do in nearly a decade. He stepped off a plane in Beijing for a high-stakes summit with President Xi Jinping. For 8 years, Canada-China relations have been in a deep freeze. We saw the Two Michaels crisis, the Huawei fallout, and the 2024 retaliatory tariff wars that crippled Canadian farmers. But Carney, a former central banker who took office just last year, campaigned on a promise of economic realism. He argued that Canada could no longer afford to be a satellite of an increasingly protectionist United States. The deal they signed in the Great Hall of the People was a bombshell. Formally called the Strategic Partnership on Energy and Agri-Food, it essentially broke the North American unified front against Chinese expansion. The most controversial clause? Canada will allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into its market every year at a tariff rate of just 6.1%. This is a direct slap in the face to the U.S. policy of 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. In exchange, China is slashing its own punitive tariffs on Canadian canola seed, a $4 billion market, from 85% down to just 15%. They are also eliminating duties on Canadian lobster, crab, and wood products. For the farmers in Saskatchewan and the fishermen in the Maritimes, Carney is a hero who just saved their livelihoods. But for the auto workers in Ontario and the trade hawks in Washington, this deal looks like a Trojan horse. The drama intensified 5 days later at the World Economic Forum in Davos. This is where the ideological battle lines were drawn in permanent ink. On Tuesday, January 20th, Mark Carney took the stage at the Congress Center. The room was packed with the global elite, many of whom have spent the last year watching the U.S. move toward a Fortress America isolationism. Carney's speech was not the typical diplomatic boilerplate. He called it a rupture, not a transition. He told the world that the rules-based international order, the system that allowed Canada to thrive under the U.S. security umbrella for 80 years, is dead. He spoke about the weaponization of integration, where great powers use supply chains as leverage. He made a direct appeal to other middle powers, India, Indonesia, Brazil, and the EU, to form a new bloc. His most famous line of the week has already become a slogan for his government. Middle powers must act together because if you are not at the table, "We're on the menu." The response from the White House was swift and personal. The following day, January 21st, Donald Trump took the same stage. He spent a significant portion of his time mocking Governor Carney, as he now calls the Prime Minister, implying Canada has lost its sovereignty and is essentially the 51st state. He doubled down on his demand that Denmark cede Greenland to the U.S. for his Golden Dome missile shield, and he warned that if Canada wants to play both sides with China, they will pay the ultimate price at the border. "Canada lives because of the United States," Trump declared. "Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements." Why is this happening now? Why the 100% tariff threat this morning? It all leads to a single date on the calendar, July 1st, 2026. This is the 6-year anniversary of the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. When the deal was signed in Trump's first term, it included a sunset clause. Every 6 years, all 3 countries must confirm in writing that they want to continue the partnership. If any one country refuses to sign, the deal doesn't die immediately, but it enters a review and terminate cycle. It creates a decade of uncertainty that would effectively stop all long-term investment in North America. Trump is using the 100% tariff threat as a hammer to win the July 1st negotiation before it even begins. He has 2 main demands. First, he wants harmonized China policies. He is demanding that Canada and Mexico match U.S. tariffs on China 1-for-1. No 6% EV deals, no special canola partnerships. Second, he wants to close the backdoor loophole. The U.S. Treasury claims that Chinese companies are flooding Canada and Mexico with investment, building shell factories that do the bare minimum of assembly to qualify products as North American under the rules of origin. They see the 49,000 Chinese EVs heading to Canada as the first wave of a Chinese invasion into the U.S. market via the Windsor-Detroit border. Mark Carney's strategy is based on a single cold realization: Canada is too dependent on an unpredictable neighbor. Currently, 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. For a century, this was Canada's greatest strength. Today, it is its greatest vulnerability. If Washington can threaten to double your prices because they don't like your foreign policy, you aren't a partner. You're a subordinate. Carney is attempting a pivot that economists call strategic autonomy. He is shifting Canada's trade focus toward the Indo-Pacific and has set an ambitious goal to increase trade with China by 50% by 2030. But the gamble is immense. If he moves too fast toward China, he loses the U.S. market, which represents $900 billion in annual bilateral trade. If he backs down and cancels the China deal, he proves that Canada has no independent foreign policy. This morning's threat of 100% tariffs is essentially a game of economic chicken with the highest possible stakes. Canada is the top export destination for 36 U.S. states. Every day, $3 billion worth of goods cross that border. Canada provides 60% of U.S. crude oil and 85% of its electricity imports. If you double the price of Canadian energy overnight, you trigger a price shock at the gas pump that would lead to a national recession. We are now in a 6-month countdown to the July 1st deadline. Everything happening right now, the EV deals, the Davos speeches, the Board of Peace drama, is positioning for that final negotiation. Trump wants to lock Canada and Mexico into an American-led Fortress North America, where they have no independent trade policy with China. Carney wants strategic sovereignty, the right to make Canada's own choices on the world stage. As of today, January 28, 2026, the longest undefended border in the world has become the front line of a new global order. To understand why a 100% tariff is even being discussed today, on January 28th, we have to look at the legal and structural trap that was set years ago. Most people think of trade agreements as permanent treaties, but the USMCA, the deal that replaced NAFTA, is different. It contains a unique joint review clause, specifically Article 34.7. This clause mandates that on the 6th anniversary of the deal, July 1, 2026, all three nations must sit down and formally decide if they want to extend the agreement for another 16 years. This isn't a routine checkup. It is a sunset provision. If any one country, like the U.S., refuses to sign the renewal, the agreement doesn't vanish overnight, but it enters a review and terminate cycle. It becomes a zombie agreement, reviewed annually until it finally expires in 2036. This creates a decade of lethal uncertainty. No CEO is going to build a billion-dollar battery plant in Ontario or a semiconductor factory in Arizona if they don't know if the trade rules will exist in 12 months. Trump is using the 100% tariff threat as a preemptive strike to dictate the terms of that July 1st meeting. His goal is policy harmonization. He is effectively telling Canada, if you want access to the American market, you must treat China exactly the way we do. This means no preferential quotas for Chinese EVs, no independent agri-food deals with Beijing, and total alignment with Washington's Fortress North America strategy. But Carney's government is pointing to a massive contradiction in the American position. While the White House calls Canada a backdoor for Chinese goods, the actual data tells a more complex story. A recent 2026 study shows that transshipment, the practice of Chinese goods being slightly modified in Canada just to get a Made in Canada sticker, is statistically minimal compared to the scale of legitimate trade. Yet, in the high-stakes theater of January 2026, the nuance of the data doesn't matter as much as the political optics. This brings us to the energy trap, the most dangerous piece of this entire chess match. While Trump threatens 100% tariffs on every single good, Canada holds a unique card that Mexico and China do not. Canada is not just a trade partner, it is the primary life support system for the American energy grid. As of today, Canada provides 60% of all U.S. crude oil imports. More importantly, it provides 85% of U.S. electricity imports. In states like New York, Vermont, and Michigan, the lights stay on because of Canadian hydropower. Since early 2025, when Trump issued an executive order placing a 10% security levy on Canadian energy, the American Action Forum has tracked the fallout. Even that small 10% tax added an estimated 20 to 30 cents per gallon to the price of gasoline in the U.S. Midwest. If that tariff jumps to 100%, as threatened this morning, the math becomes terrifying for the American consumer. We are talking about a scenario where gas prices don't just rise, they double. We are talking about electricity bills in the Northeast becoming higher than mortgage payments during the peak of winter. For the massive new AI data centers currently being built in Ohio and Virginia, centers that require enormous amounts of stable imported power, a 100% tariff would be an extinction-level event for their profitability. Carney knows this. His resilience over reliance strategy, launched on January 7th, is built on the belief that the U.S. economy is too physically integrated with Canada to actually survive a total trade severing. He is betting that the American manufacturing base, which is already absorbing 35% tariffs on steel and aluminum, will revolt before the 100% threat can be fully implemented. In fact, U.S. steelmakers like Nucor are already warning that while tariffs protect their domestic market share, the uncertainty surrounding the July 1st USMCA review is chilling the very infrastructure projects, like the U.S.-Mexico border fence, that they are supposed to be supplying. The integration is so deep that a 100% tariff on Canadian lumber and steel would effectively halt the American construction industry overnight. So, as we sit here on January 28th, the world is watching a game of chicken where both drivers are headed toward a cliff. Trump is betting that the Canadian economy, which is 10 times smaller than the U.S. and depends on the border for 20% of its GDP, will blink first. Carney is betting that the American voter, already frustrated by an average tax increase of $1,000 per household due to existing 2025 tariffs, will not tolerate the inflationary bomb that a 100% Canadian tariff would represent. Everything is now a prelude to the July deadline. In the next part, we will look at the China pivot in detail, why Canada chose 49,000 electric vehicles as the hill to die on, and how Beijing is using this rift to dismantle American influence in the Western Hemisphere. While Washington sees Canada's new deal with China as a betrayal, Mark Carney is framing it as economic realism. To understand why Canada decided to risk its entire relationship with the U.S. over 49,000 Chinese cars, you have to look at the math of the Canadian middle class. For the last 2 years, Canada followed the U.S. lead perfectly. In 2024, Ottawa imposed a 100% surtax on Chinese electric vehicles, matching the Biden-Trump consensus. The result? Canadian consumers were locked into some of the highest EV prices in the world, and Canadian farmers were hit with devastating retaliatory tariffs from Beijing. On January 15, 2026, Carney broke that consensus. Under the new Strategic Partnership on Energy and Agri-Food, Canada didn't just lower tariffs, they created a strategic gateway. The 49,000 vehicle quota isn't a random number. It represents roughly 3% of the total Canadian auto market. It's just enough to offer Canadians affordable options like the BYD Seagull, which retails in China for under $15,000 CAD, without completely destroying the domestic manufacturing base in Ontario. But China isn't just sending cars. In exchange for this market access, Beijing has agreed to lower the punitive 85% tariff on Canadian canola down to a most favored nation rate of 15%. For the prairie provinces, this is the difference between bankruptcy and a multi-billion-dollar windfall. As of today, January 28th, the first shipments of Canadian lobster and crab are already clearing Chinese customs duty-free for the first time in nearly a decade. From Beijing's perspective, this is a masterclass in geopolitical arbitrage. By offering Canada a realistic and respectful alternative to Trump's volatility, China is successfully driving a wedge into the heart of the G7. President Xi Jinping knows that every time Trump calls Carney a governor or threatens to annex Greenland, the Canadian public's desire for independence grows. Beijing is also using the Carney model as a template for other middle powers. They are showing the world that if you are willing to break ranks with Washington's tariff wall, China will reward you with market access and investment. In fact, a secret clause in the January 15th agreement suggests that Chinese EV giants like BYD and Leapmotor are already scouting locations for joint venture assembly plants in Ontario and Quebec. This is exactly what has triggered the 100% tariff threat this morning. Trump's administration is terrified that these factories will become the ultimate backdoor. If a Chinese company builds a car in Canada using Canadian labor and Canadian software, it technically fulfills the rules of origin under the USMCA. Trump has called this a drop-off port scheme, warning on social media just 48 hours ago